British Foreign Secretary Jack Straw took questions on terrorism and British foreign policy from members of the British House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee this week. This is an hour and 50 minutes.
Good afternoon, everybody. This session gives us an opportunity to question the Foreign Secretary and senior officials about the foreign policy aspects of the war on terrorism. We are very pleased to have you before us, Jack, and I know you've been travelling across the Atlantic. No doubt that might come up at some point in our questioning. Can I just ask you briefly to introduce your two colleagues?
It's David Richmond, who's Director General Defence and Intelligence, and it's Peter Goodrem, who is Director Middle East and North Africa.
Thank you very much. If I can begin by asking about the current increase in terrorist attacks, both in this country and worldwide. And we've just got news of these appalling bombings in Iraq today. It's clear to us, and we had evidence last week from Peter Taylor and Professor Paul Wilkinson, that the fight against international terrorism is going into a new phase and is probably more difficult. Could you tell us, do you think we're winning in this fight against international terrorism? And have things changed since the period around 9/11 to the current situation?
Well, first of all, we've just had news of this bombing of a hotel in Baghdad, one which is used by journalists. The fact that there appear to have been at least 15, if not many more, fatalities indicates the indiscriminate nature of these terrorists, who really don't mind who they kill, provided they kill somebody in the name of a totally perverted ideology. And it's a further illustration of the evil that we are dealing with. I don't want to use the phrase that you used, and it would be for historians to judge whether we have been successful in this overall fight. What I do believe is that the strategy that we are embarked on, which is dealing directly with terrorism in this country and anywhere else where we have direct involvement, indirectly by international engagement and sharing of intelligence and resources with our international partners, as well as seeking to deal with the causes of terrorism, for example, in the work we've done over many years to support the Middle East peace process, the very active engagement of the United States and United Kingdom government, Colin Powell, Secretary Condoleezza Rice, myself in the peace process in respect of Kashmir, many other theatres, and the work which we in the UK government are doing, both in the Home Office and the Foreign Office, to improve understanding of Islam and to give those who are of the Islamic faith greater confidence to stand up against these evil people. All of that is the only strategy that is sensible to follow. And one other thing I'd simply say, as I was in preparation for this session, I was looking down a list of all the sites where there have been terrorist outrages over the last 12 years. It's everywhere. Tokyo, Saudi Arabia, Tanzania, Kenya, Aden, then obviously the World Trade Center, Karachi, Aden, Bali, Mombasa, Riyadh, Casablanca, Jakarta. This is a worldwide problem, and it requires real international effort.
You referred to the causes. One of the things that strikes me is the way in which the people who justify these actions use all kinds of different excuses or reasons. And one of the things they're very effective at is a propaganda campaign whereby they talk about events that happened in Timor or Kashmir, you mentioned, or the Middle East, or even the Andalusia and 1450s in the period in Europe. Do you think we're doing enough to counter this propaganda?
Well, I think we can never do enough to counter the propaganda. It is the most extraordinary sort of moral relativism, and we have to counter it, and we have to say there are some absolutes in our society. A society can't work unless we are clear of the difference between good and evil, and this terrorism is simply evil. I was reflecting on this actually in the context of the visit I made over the weekend to Birmingham, Alabama. You had the most appalling racism there, which escalated until a church was bombed, 4 little girls got killed. Now, you could offer explanations as to what was in the minds of the people who planted those bombs, but whatever explanations you offer, you cannot conceivably justify that. You can offer explanations as to why there was a climate in which extremism came to the fore in Germany before the war, and plenty of historians have said that the international community shared responsibility for making the situation worse than it might have been following the Treaty of Versailles. But all that said, you cannot possibly excuse or justify Nazism. It was simply a straightforward evil, and the evil that was being carried out was far greater than any of the problems it was designed to overcome. The same is true with this terrorism. And what I know, having charted it before and after the 11th of September, is that these people are so evil, they will seize on any excuse or none. They will seize on an excuse: injustice in Palestine, injustice in Chechnya, injustice in Kashmir. If those excuses have gone, and we're working actually very hard, certainly in respect of the Middle East and in respect of Kashmir, we have some influence. It's for the Russian Federation, obviously, to resolve the Chechen situation. But if they've gone, they will seize on some other excuses. Now, for sure, in order to ensure that their recruiting sergeants are less successful, and for many other reasons, we need to secure a just settlement between the Israelis and the Palestinians in respect to the Middle East, and, for example, between the Indians and the Pakistanis and the Kashmiris in respect to Kashmir. But we'd be naive if we thought if we eliminated those problems, this infection had gone. It won't.
But we're spending billions of pounds in various theatres on military activities, Afghanistan, Iraq, elsewhere. Yet we don't spend even a very small percentage of that on propaganda, communications, media. I'll give you one example: the BBC Arabic television service, which hasn't yet been established, and would cost far less than we spent even in a very short period in pursuing the war in Iraq. Do you think we get our priorities right? Should we be shifting resources more into the other areas?
First of all, there will be an announcement by the BBC World Service tomorrow about the future of their programming. I don't want to preempt that, but I think this committee will find that of interest. The second thing is that, however, we shouldn't see the BBC as part of a, quotes, propaganda effort. There's a strong case for a BBC Arabic service, television service, but the BBC's credibility would be severely undermined if people thought that it was simply a mouthpiece of the British government or even of the British Parliament. I mean, yes, we fund it. It's on my vote. But we've got to be very, very careful about the nature of the relationship in order to preserve that independence for the BBC, which is a watchword around the world. What we spend quite a lot of money, £10 million, on what's the nature of the programme called, David?
Engaging the Islamic world.
Engaging the Islamic world, which of course I do my part of the Islamic world on a day-by-day basis. I've received none of this 10 million, let me tell you. But we spend £10 million, and that's a big increase in the amount we have been spending in terms of engaging the Islamic world with all sorts of programmes. We'll give you details of those. But I'm also clear that if we want to engage the minds of people in the Islamic world, we need to see better progress, for example, on the Middle East peace process. And actually, knock on wood, there the prognosis is much, much better than it was certainly 2 years ago, not a year ago.
Gisela Stewart.
Can I follow on this? Given that the long term, it's an engaging of the minds, and we need to work with the BBC, and as you say, we spent £10 million on this, but we also need to build nation states in some areas like the Balkans. Is it therefore wise for the Foreign Office to withdraw granting aid from organisations such as the British Association of Eastern and Central Europe, which has got a proven track record in terms of money, spends very little money, but does exactly what we do and has shown that they can do it?
Well, I'm not altogether certain. By pure chance, I'm going to have a short meeting with Lord Radici straight after this session if it doesn't go on too long. I'm not caught up in a vote, otherwise there'll be a separate meeting with him. With particular grants in aid, there will always likely to come a moment when there'll be a judgment that maybe their usefulness has run its course, and that's the issue here. But I need to talk to Lord Radici before coming to a final view.
I think for massive record, better declare that both the fellow member of the committee, Paul Keator, are trustees of the organisation.
Okay, right.
Okay. Ken Purchase.
Thank you, Jack. Jack, we've been used over centuries to deal with people dissatisfied for one reason or another. Usually some massive inequalities in the society people inhabit, and we've dealt with it because it's rational, and we can say, right, we can create an improvement. Now we seem to be facing not a rational demand for improvements, but a demand from a religion which will not be satisfied until its religion is accepted as the only religion throughout the world. Are we getting to a point where we might just expect terrorism to continue and we can't prove there isn't a God and ask them to pack up their tent?
Well, first of all, can I say that it is. I don't think it is a demand from a religion, because that is to admit that these evil people speak in the name of Islam, which no decent Muslim I know believes, and none of the rest of us believe, and there is overwhelming warrant from the Holy Quran to show that is simply not the case. But if you're asking Mr. Purchase whether is this appetite for terror by some of these individuals ever going to be satiated? Not by the key individuals, I don't think. I think they are so fanatical, as, to use the comparison, some of the Nazi leaders were in the end. They had tasted blood, they had enjoyed it, huge power from killing, and they wanted to go on and on and on. But I think that we can succeed against their foot soldiers. Both in dealing with it on a security basis, but also in making it clear to people that this provides no hope whatever for them. And if you take the issue, to go back, Mr. Chairman, to where you started, which is Iraq, we knew that there was going to be, or likely to be, an increase in terrorist incidents in Iraq in the run-up, right through the the democratic process. The elections earlier in the year, setting of the constitution, this referendum, and then if the referendum leads to a yes, the full constitutional elections on December the 15th. The terrorists are desperately trying to stop this democratic process taking place. Why? Because they know that if the democratic process in Iraq embeds itself, then their opportunities to rule this country through terror rather than through democracy are much, much more limited. And you will then see that some of those who, for odd reasons, fear or unemployment.
What do they want?
Well,
what's the demand?
Well, if you read, for that you'd need to go onto the website of Al-Qaeda-related apologist organisations. There are plenty of them. Some of them want to establish a caliphate across the Islamic world. They want to exclude all infidel disbelievers. Bear in mind, however, that these people claim not only our everybody around the table, because I don't see a number of Islamic faith around the table. Not only are those of us of other religions infidel, but also those who do not follow their very extreme brand are also unbelievers. So it's sort of fanaticism on fanaticism, and it's for that reason that there is increasing rejection of by the vast majority of people in the Muslim community of this hijacking of their religion.
Paul Keach.
Foreign Secretary, I want to turn to Iraq, because obviously we are here today to discuss the foreign policy aspects of the war against terrorism, and I want to place Iraq, if I can, in that context.
Sure.
Now, obviously, you and I took a different view in the run-up to Iraq. You won the vote, and I don't want to re-rehearse those arguments. Nor do I necessarily want to go through the arguments about what's happening in Iraq at the moment. There are some very good signs, the political process. There are some less good signs in the bombing this afternoon, etc. But what I want to try and understand is I want to put Iraq in the context of that overarching war against terrorism. You were absolutely right when you said that terrorism occurred before then, and certainly after 9/11, President Bush assembled a huge world support for that campaign. The front page of Le Monde said, "We are all Americans now." My concern at the time, and my continued concern, is that Iraq has been a distraction from that campaign against terrorism, that has led us down a path that has taken resources, money and effort that should have been concentrated on that much wider picture. And therefore I firstly want to ask you, in the run-up to Iraq, what was your assessment of that engagement on its effect of the war against terrorism? Did you actually believe that by invading Iraq it would improve the security situation in the United Kingdom and improve the war against terrorism? Or were you warned, and was there a suspicion that this attack on Iraq by itself might in some way undermine the overall war on terrorism?
Well, I certainly never ever believed that military action was a great distraction from the war on terrorism. Let's be clear about this. Also bear in mind, Mr. Keach, you said you weren't going to rehearse what happened, but you've just done so. That we only came to the decision about military action very late and very reluctantly. It was after the failure of the Security Council on the 7th of March 2003 to agree a second resolution, albeit a modified one which I put forward, and then the announcement by the French President on the 10th that whatever the circumstances he would vote no, that we were then into a situation that led 7 days later to the Cabinet's decision and then Parliament's decision the next day to take military action. I believed, and I still believe, that the military action that we took in Iraq was justified on the basis that was set out, non-compliance by Saddam of about a dozen Chapter 7 resolutions. And if you want to, yes. By all means, read the speeches that I made in the Security Council and the ones that I made in the House. That was the focus of what I spoke about. I don't happen to think this is an either-or. What I also believe is that although self-evidently there are and remain serious security challenges in Iraq, I believe that the only way we're going to get relative peace and security across the Middle East is through democracy. And we are seeing the beginnings of this. I mean, some of the things that happened are quite remarkable. What is happening in the Lebanon? Who would have said that Lebanon, whose nationhood had been denied and is still denied by Syria, it was run by Syria as a fiefdom. The Lebanon is now emerging into full independence, and some of those who kept the Lebanon as a fiefdom are now under the most serious spotlight from the international community.
Sorry, I asked about Iraq and our action in Iraq and the effect of that on the campaign against terrorism, not Lebanon.
What I'm just saying is we are seeing the beginnings of a movement for democracy, which I believe is the only sure way of eliminating terror and above all, and alongside the lack of progress in the Arab countries, which is another cause of this, or contributor to the environment in which terrorism can breed, is through democracy. Now, we wouldn't have got to where we have got to in Iraq, right? A release of Iraq from terrorism, from tyranny, and the most terrible tyranny, state terrorism, to a situation where just 2.5 years later, we are awaiting the results of a democratic referendum in which, according to the latest reports, nearly 10 million people have voted, up from 8.6 million in January. It is going to be hard going in Iraq. The terrorism will continue for some time, but I also believe that historians are likely to judge that this has led to the establishment of a democratic and stable state. I'll also add this, that nation building is never easy. There are those who think that what happened after the war was that what was left of the German government surrendered, and then, hey presto, very quickly after that, you had the building of the German state. Not true. There were no national elections in Germany for 4 years. The Marshall Plan, after 2 years, arose because of real concern about the chaos of reconstruction. Austria was under Allied rule for 10 years. Didn't emerge, it became a nation for 10 years. There was a similar situation with respect to Japan. In all countries which emerge from such tyranny, you're going to have a period of transition. All are different. I'm not saying Iraq is Germany or Germany is Iraq, but there are lessons very clearly from each.
In terms of my question, then, I assume that the Foreign Office did consider what the effect of the war on terrorism would be by invading Iraq. And your assumption was it would not make the overall war on terrorism worse.
Look, in the run-up to as serious a decision as military action, you're bound to look at all possible consequences. But did we believe that taking military action would make the overall terrorist situation worse? No, we did not. All right. I mean, that was our judgment. It's not, I mean, of course, there are others around the system who may have taken a different view, but no, we did not.
I'm grateful for that, Francis Day. We had some very interesting evidence last week from Mr. Paul Wilkinson from the University of St Andrews, and let me just quote what he said in his paper to us. One of them, and this is a quote: "One of the most significant developments in the evolution of Al-Qaeda since 2003 has been the way the movement has exploited the Allied invasion and occupation of Iraq. Whatever view one may take on the decision to invade Iraq, it is simply ignoring reality to deny that the invasion and occupation have been a big boost for Al-Qaeda and a setback for the coalition against terrorism." What Mr. Wilkinson is suggesting is that the images of British and American troops in Iraq are fueling abroad what he calls a domestic jihad and actually increasing the unhappiness and the frustration felt by Muslims in our own country and other countries, and that process has increased and has made the overall war on terrorism worse. I presume you would disagree with that.
Yeah, I mean, look, it is self-evident truth that Al-Qaeda, etc., are exploiting what's going on in Iraq, but they're also exploiting what's going on in Saudi Arabia, in Indonesia, in Egypt, in Russia.
But there are no British troops there. There are British troops there.
But that's my point. There are no British troops there. They're exploiting them. Indonesia was against the Iraq war. Indonesia suffered continuous Al-Qaeda-inspired terrorism. Saudi Arabia was not happy about the Iraq war. It suffered terrorism. Egypt was not happy about the Iraq war. It has suffered very recently serious terrorist outrages within its territory. The Russian Federation was against the Iraq war. It's had to put up and to deal with the most appalling terrorism. At each stage, these people seek to justify their terrorism by anything that they can find. And on your point about, is this affecting the Muslim population in this country? Well, opinions will differ, but I keep in very, very close touch with the communities of the Islamic faith in my own constituency. If I didn't, I wouldn't be here. No. It's the third largest Muslim population in a constituency proportionally of any in the country. There were 7 candidates at the last election, 6 against me, all 6 who said they opposed the Iraq War, including the Conservative, let me say. Published official documents, but all 6 who said they opposed the Iraq War, all 6 who said that the way to emphasise opposition, particularly among the Muslim communities, was to vote against me and vote me out of office. My majority went down from 9,000 to 8,000. I ended up with a very significant level of support amongst the Muslim communities. Why? Because, yes, if you do simply an opinion poll amongst the Muslim communities in Blackburn, they would disproportionately say they opposed the Iraq War. But they're not taken in by all this propaganda from terrorists, apologists for terrorists and others. And they were able to make a mature judgment. And they could see what we've been doing in respect of the Middle East, what we've been doing in respect of Kashmir and much else, and came to the conclusion they did.
I'm grateful if I made one very brief question. The other question that we had last week from Mr. Peter Taylor of the BBC was that Iraq was also providing a training ground for terrorists, that they were able to get involved in terrorism and then come back from there to Europe. And indeed a senior French judge made the similar point, I think, last week. Again, is it your belief that people actively involved in terrorism against coalition forces in Iraq are gaining from that experience in their perception and then returning back to the United Kingdom and other parts of Europe?
I have to say that Mr. Richmond can correct me if I'm wrong. I've actually seen no evidence at all to suggest that there are people who are being trained within Iraq who are coming back here. The potential areas of training of potential. Have you seen any?
No, I think it's something that we worry about. I haven't seen any evidence of it.
Right. Great. Thank you.
John Nichols, please.
The Iraqi constitution has been rejected by overwhelming majorities in 2 of the Sunni provinces. If it's rejected in a third, which looks highly likely in Nineveh in the next 2 or 3 days, what are we going to do?
Well, we say this is democracy, and if you invite people to vote.
No, I'm asking what we're going to do if
I'll tell you what we're going to do. Okay, we then allow the constitutional arrangements to go ahead. There will be elections in any event on December the 15th. This is factored into the constitution. So you do what if a referendum fails, it may be something which people regret, but this is democracy. And what we'll also do is point out to Sunni who may have been reluctant to have been involved back in January in the elections that it is far better for them to make use of democratic arrangements to resolve the conflicts which they have with the Shia and the Kurds than it is to support violence. That this is democracy working. That this...
Sorry, I understand. Of course I understand it's democracy working, but our policy, our collective policy, has been to develop a constitution to get it approved. If it's rejected, there are new elections for an assembly. Are you saying that new assembly is more likely to be able to reach a constitutional
what also happens, so you know, is that there will have to be, even if the referendum passes and the constitution then comes into force, there will have to be quite a number of further amendments made to the constitution. Almost certainly. And I think that there is a provision, I think, I can be corrected on this, I think there's a provision that these changes would have to be put to a further referendum within 4 months. If there isn't a yes vote, then there will be a further interim government elected on December the 15th. And the Constituent Assembly then has a year in which to come forward with changes to the Constitution, which will then go to a further referendum. So, those who are obviously seeking immediate stability, particularly those in the Shia and the Kurdish population, obviously would have wanted to see a yes vote. And it's also the case that, and we know this for certain, that there will be a very large majority of Iraqi voters who will have voted yes in the elections. But this arrangement by which 2/3 of voters voting no in 3 provinces could block a constitution was agreed there, ironically, for the benefit of the Kurds originally when the transitional administrative law was developed in the summer of last year. And there's no reason at all why other groups, particularly the Sunni, should not be allowed to use it. Now, you then were asking me, I think, Mr. Maples, what I think would happen. What I think will happen is that there will be further negotiations between the Sunni and the Shia to try and arrive at a solution satisfactory to both sides. Interestingly, things were moving in that direction in the run-up to the referendum, so that there were further amendments made. I mean, all through, they're supposed to be signed off in the middle of August, but all through last month and the beginning of this month, further amendments were made. You'll just see that process continuing, I think.
Well, it seemed to me that it was entirely foreseeable this was going to happen. The Sunnis have not participated fully in the constitutional process, and that the result of this will actually be the deferral of a solution for at least a year, if not longer. That during that time, the instability will get worse because it will encourage the terrorists in thinking that they have succeeded in one of their objectives, and that the likelihood of the country breaking up into at least 3 and perhaps more constituent parts will be far greater.
Well, I don't accept that. First of all,
you don't think it will? You don't think there's any prospect?
First of all, we don't know what the result is going to be. There are. It's clear that in Anbar, 97% of voters or so say that we are told have voted no, and in Salahuddin it's 82%. Now there's an issue at the moment about what has happened in Nineveh, which is the area around Mosul, which is a mixed area, and we don't know whether or not there's going to be a yes vote or a no vote, and if it is a no vote, whether it's a no vote by 2/3. I spoke to UN Secretary General.
No, but we're working on the basis that if it is a no vote.
Yeah, but let me say, I spoke to Secretary General Kofi Annan yesterday and on Saturday about this, because obviously in everybody's interest that the process of checking should be come to a close as quickly as possible. But I don't accept your rather apocalyptic view about what's then going to happen. I just say this: if you trust the people, you have to trust the people to come out with the result that they want.
The result they may want is 3 separate constituent.
Well, I don't know, but because one of the things they're all agreed on is that there has to be a single Iraq. That's also absolutely fundamental to the international community. The Kurds are not campaigning for a separate Kurdistan, and they know, in any event, the consequences of that in relation both to Turkey and to Iran would be very, very severe. I mean, if you talk to Mr. Barzani, President Talabani, and the other leaders of KDP and the PUK, they know that, whatever historical aspiration they may have had. The Shia also know that once a full democratic system of government is established, because they are 60% of the population, that where the politics turns on people being Shia rather than Sunni or Kurd, that their view is going to hold sway. So what on earth is in it for them to break up this country, which anyway has been a single unity since the breakup of the Ottoman Empire? So my point back to you, Mr. Maples, is this: yes, from the point of view of the international community, there is plainly a hope that the electoral and constitutional processes can proceed smoothly, that there is a yes vote. But if you give people a vote, you have to accept the answer that they come up with. And it is not the end of the world at all if the answer is no. This is anticipated in the drafting of the transitional administrative law and in the constitution. And also, when I talk to our people in Baghdad, what they say to me is that in practice, the difference between having a yes vote, which for sure will be cleaner, but in terms of time and tidying up the constitution then, and having a no vote and having to make some amendments to lead to a further consensus, would not be quite as long as people anticipate.
But they would be radically different outcomes. Can we just turn briefly to Basra, because we were congratulating ourselves until quite recently that we'd done rather well in the southern part of Iraq, and that it was much more stable. We seem to have done that by working very closely with the main Shiite group. However, now we seem to have a situation in which the various Shiite groups and militias have fallen out among themselves, stirred up by Iran, which wasn't happening apparently until a few months ago. And it seems to me that we are likely to, and the same animosity towards British troops is now being demonstrated there as has been for 2.5 years in the other parts of Iraq against the Americans. It seems to me that we've got almost as bad a situation there as the United States has got in the Sunni triangle.
Well, I think it's very important not to generalise, and that also applies, may I say, to the areas under the with direct control, as it were, of the American troops. American troops have got a relatively good level of consent in some provinces and some parts of some provinces, and obviously poor consent in other parts. My understanding, so far as Basra is concerned, is yes, there was a particular problem with this section of the Iraqi security forces, and with some dominant individuals, but it's by no means universal. I also just say to you, Mr. Maples, that although I think all of us are very proud indeed of the way in which our troops have operated, seeking to build consent, they've always made it clear that if necessary, they would be very firm and very tough, and that was why they took the action that they did, which I think was about 3 weeks ago, wasn't it? Do you want to add anything on that situation?
Well, I mean, obviously we hope that that will be the outcome. Can I just finish up? So we now have a situation in which the insurgency seems to be worse in the Sunni parts than it's been before. The constitution is almost certainly, I would suggest to you, going to get rejected. We now have chaos and fighting in Basra, with Iran stirring up trouble there in a way that I don't think any of us have foreseen. I mean, isn't it really time that we admitted that we went to war here on a false premise for all the right motives, but nevertheless there weren't any weapons of mass destruction? We have fundamentally miscalculated and misunderstood the nature of Iraqi society, the potential for divisions within it, and the potential for the insurgency. And wouldn't it actually help us to get from here to a satisfactory exit if we admitted we'd made those mistakes?
Well, if we thought that, and evidently you do, yes, I don't have to think it. So
you don't even made any mistakes?
Well, that's another quite separate issue. But if you're asking me whether I think that we made any fundamental mistakes in the overall strategy, no, I don't. I mean, if you're asking me day by day whether things we could have done better, the benefit of hindsight, well, of course that's the case, and it would be arrogant to say otherwise. But what you're admitting in all this is the degree to which you come out with a catalogue of bad news. What you're omitting in all this is the most important message of all this year, 2005, which is this: the Iraqis have embraced democracy. People said we didn't understand the nature of Iraqi society, meaning we didn't understand that they didn't really want to be democrats. They didn't really have any interest. They just wanted to be dominated by tyrants. Well, 8.5 million Iraqis proved those people wrong on the 30th of January, and 10 million proved them wrong again on the 15th of October. The Iraqis want what we take for granted, which is the right to run their own affairs. It's called democracy. And what we're seeking to do is to support that process. It's also a process backed by the United Nations. And although you're right to say that there were big divisions in the international community and nationally over the rightness or wrongness of the military action, post-war, we have been there on the basis of United Nations Security Council resolutions, and the key resolution now, 1546, was passed in June of last year, unanimously, and it's that provides the mandate for the multinational force and the electoral timetable and institutions.
Richard Younger-Ross.
Can I just pursue on Basra? I had the privilege to visit there just after the fighting finished and saw what an excellent task our forces were doing. I have to say that they were clearly not fully prepared for the task in front of them, because it clearly had not been thought out by the government that it needed extra DFID help and it needed advisors in on police and other areas. But they did a magnificent job in dealing with the local tribal issues, working with the local community. There is clearly a deterioration in the relationships between our forces there and the local authorities. What's being done to build those bridges?
Well, a great deal, and I can let the committee have a detailed note about that if you wish, Mr. Chairman. But look, our people, both in the military and in the Consul General in Basra, as well as in associated government agencies like DFID, are alive to the need to have the best possible relationships with local leaders. As Mr. Maples indicated, part of what happened was that, in his phrase, some local leaders fell out. And there's going to be a lot of vying for power, particularly as people see that power is shifting from the rather the tyrannical arrangements which people knew about under Saddam and what has been there subsequently, to democratic processes, which are far better, but actually slightly less certain. So there's going to be a lot of vying for power going on. That's what we've had to cope with. But I don't, for the reasons I've already explained to Mr. Maples, take an overly pessimistic view about the longer-term prognosis there.
Just consider on that. I mean, are we not in a position though where the clerics and the extreme clerics are going to say, is they came here, they promised us water, they promised us electricity, they failed to do those on time, they're still not working properly, they promised us this, they promised us that, and they've not delivered. Are we not, in our failure, in particular in terms of security, actually giving extra credit to the clerics to put us in a bad light?
Well, two things here. One is to the extent that the reconstruction process has lagged behind, it's all down to security. One other thing that has happened for the good is that, and this has been again a very big change in the last year, is that thousands more Iraqi security forces have been trained up over the last year. I think it's now up to about 170,000. Their ability to operate independently of the US, UK and other coalition forces varies considerably. There are, I think, 2 battalions which can operate entirely independently, but a great many which are able to operate effectively with backing from the coalition. That's been a big change, and the progress with the defence forces has actually been better than the progress with the police in some area, where there remains a problem. On your point about the clerics, I mean, I think it's quite important to appreciate that some of those you describe as clerics have been a very powerful moderating force within Iraqi society, particularly in this case in the south, amongst the Shia. I mean, without Ayatollah Sistani's great wisdom and judgment, I think we'd be in a rather more difficult position. So a lot of it is the nature of that society that a lot of the leaders are clerics. Let me say, this certainly was the case in my party and yours for a very long time, that the Protestant nonconformist churches played a leading part in our. So it's not. It doesn't like. Well, it's just true. And people also used to say of the Conservative Party, of the Church of England, it was the Conservative Party of prayer. It doesn't lie in our mouth to pretend that we are a wholly secular society where organised religion plays no part in politics, because it does play a very important part.
I very carefully used the word extreme before I used the word cleric, and I appreciate that a large number of them are working and are a moderating force. But I am concerned that there is more power is being given to those who don't wish to see the sort of democracy that we wish to see, but wish to go back to the sort of democracy they have in Iran, rather than the sort of democracy you described earlier.
There isn't.
And I fear, just one final point, so that we want to move on, is I fear that what we all move towards is a new Vietnam, where we are actually being picked up at the same time by these other groups who can't agree to the model of democracy we're putting forward.
It's good for a headline in liberal news, but it's complete nonsense. It's complete nonsense. It's complete nonsense. I mean, the parallels are about zero. With great respect to you, I mean, just look at the fact that you've now got a UN-backed democratic process, right? There wasn't ever a single United Nations Security Council resolution in respect of Vietnam. Everybody's agreed in the Security Council about the strategy needed to put Iraq on a settled path. Two other things I'd say is this. There does not seem to be any particular appetite amongst the Iraqis to set up a structure similar to that in Iran, although it is true that the majority of Iranians are Shia, and in the south and other parts of Iraq, a significant proportion of the Iraqis are Shia. The Iraqis are Arab. The Iranians are not Arab. They're Persians. There is quite a big. I mean, this division between the two is not accidental. It's quite powerful, and there are other reasons which explain the nature of the Iranian constitution, about which I'd be very happy to bore this committee at some length. But I also just say to you, Mr. Young-Ross, if you look at the Iraqi constitution, you will see that in the opening articles, the constitution says that it should, as it were, here I paraphrase, but only a little, it should take account of the Islamic heritage of Iraq, but it also says that it should take account of democratic rights and of human rights. And the architecture of the document is not one which makes this an Islamic state in a sort of classical sense that you have in Iran or in a different way in Saudi Arabia.
Eric Hilsley, please.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Just a very quick one, Foreign Secretary, on the Basra situation. Just
On the
Basra,
yeah.
and the incidents on the 19th of September. Just how big a disappointment was it that the newly trained police forces seemed to be in alliance with the militias in the handing over of British troops to those militias?
Well, it obviously was a disappointment. It was one section of the police force, a particular section of the police force. So it was a disappointment, and we're having to deal with that. But of course, we hoped it would have been otherwise.
Some questions about Iran now, Andrew McKinley.
Yeah.
And I'll come in a moment to IEA, Security Council, atomic weapons. But in recent weeks, the Prime Minister, yourself, and the Defence Secretary have indicated a fear that some of the ordnance and planning and preparation, some personalities involved in attacks upon British soldiers in Iraq, coalition forces, and other malevolence around the region has been done, and the word is Hezbollah or Iran. I noticed yourself said that at a press conference that explosives that killed at least 8 British soldiers originated from Hezbollah or Iran. That's pretty definite. The Downing Street Prime Minister has been fairly strong. In some parliamentary exchanges, the Defence Secretary seemed to slightly pull back from that. And I don't mean this in any spiteful way, as you would know. But it does seem to be a degree of ambiguity. In other words, so I mean, I wonder if it could give you this opportunity of you sharing with us what you do know, and you know, is it Hezbollah or Iran? And if it's the latter, to whom does one look? You know, what level is this? To what extent are the fingerprints of the Iran regime on this?
I mean, there is a degree of ambiguity about this, Mr. McKinley, because there is a degree of uncertainty about it. We believe that from forensic examination of these improvised explosive devices, that they are similar or the same to those used by Hezbollah, and that it appears that they could be traced back to Iran. We don't know about the timing involved, and we don't know directly about any involvement by the Iranian government, but is there sufficient for us to be concerned about it that we've made representations to the Iranian government? I mean, I think I've probably said enough about that. We just take that there isn't a continuation of the use of these devices.
May I sort of go on and then move to suicide bombers? There's been, I think, press reports which are not vague ones, how the regime and organs of the regime, including Iran's newly installed defence minister, had both invited volunteers for suicide bombings and celebrated them. I mean, I think there's some commemoration plan in Tehran, which by definition must have at least the tacit support of the regime, on October the 30th, entitled Men of the Sun. And this is where they're going to celebrate suicide operations and encouraging people to sign up for martyrdom-seeking operations. And the Defence Minister has indicated support for this kind of activity. What do we know about this? What representations have we made? And isn't this really something which really puts that regime beyond the pale? Because there are very few regimes, and certainly ones that we don't do business with, who are actively encouraging and promoting the concept of suicide operations around the world and around the region.
I'm going to ask Mr. Richmond to give some background on this.
Well, I mean, it is just worth remembering that they were using suicide bombers in the Iran-Iraq war, and there's therefore quite a long tradition, and these people have been celebrated. There's a foundation that looks after wives and dependents and so on. So this is something that's been existing in Iran for quite some time. I think it's true that there's recently been more publicity given to this, but we would have to actually see what they did rather than what they wrote in their newspapers.
So it's just to make the point that it's slightly more complicated because of their history of the Iran-Iraq war. We look to the government of Iran to take the same unambiguous view of terrorism that all other countries do. And a point I often make to Iraqi interlocutors is this, that with their very active support and encouragement, when I was Home Secretary, at the request of my then predecessor, late Robin Cook, I banned, under the Terrorism Act, the Iranian terrorist organisation MEK, and it's still banned. But I also banned in the same list the military wings of Hamas and Hezbollah. The Iranian government give very active support to Hezbollah and some support to Hamas. We think they should desist from that, because you have to be unambiguous in your approach to terrorist organisations. That's a conversation we continue to have with the Iranians.
And the PMOI were banned. People from Mujahideen, or was that the MEK?
Yes, MEK is back in there.
Yeah, which remained banned. I don't want to labour the point, but it seems to me that should be revisited. But I won't labour that. Can I move?
You're not supporting this terrorist organisation?
No, I'm certainly not. Okay. No.
So occasionally, you know, we're not.
But equally, things are not like
NCRI front organisation?
Well, the answer is no. But the point is that I certainly think we should always revisit those which we ban.
There are provisions in the Terrorism Act 2000 if organisations want to make representations.
But can I go, as I promised you, to the question of development of nuclear weapons? It's the IAEA have been unambiguous in their condemnation of Iran for non-compliance. There's now talk about the matter being referred to the Security Council, which seems logical. The anxiety which some have is that it will go to the Security Council and then impotence being shown, because if the Security Council does stand by the IAEA, shows robustness, there's very little that the international community can do. Is that not the case? I mean, are we? Where are we on this? How can we contain and control Iran on development of nuclear weapons?
I mean, first thing, let me just say where we are. We do not know for certain whether Iran is developing a nuclear weapons capability. What we do know for certain is that over a 20-year period, they failed to notify the IAEA of very large developments at Isfahan and Natanz of conversion and enrichment facilities and other matters. We also know that they were in close touch with A.Q. Khan, who is the man who was in the lead in developing the Pakistani bomb, and who then decided to go into business selling nuclear weapons technology. We know that they've experimented in polonium and plutonium, and there is also a large question mark as to why they need such large fuel cycle facilities to create nuclear fuel when they only have one nuclear power station, which is the one at Bushehr. That power station is being built under contract with the Russians, and the Russians are under contract to provide the fuel for it. And they have no other power stations actually ready to go. It will be indeed none in development either. So those are the question marks. You talk about impotence, but actually the record of the IAEA on Iran is one of the strength of the international community in support of one of the world's most important international treaties, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Where are we? when we started this, just in the immediate aftermath of the Iraq War, Dominic de Villepin, Joska Fischer and myself, there was every prospect that Iran would exploit the divisions in the international community and carry on regardless. They've simply not done that. And what we have been able to achieve is a situation where the enrichment of uranium is suspended, and that remains suspended. What we also achieved for a period was the suspension of the conversion facility at Isfahan. The Iranians chose to restart that they made their decision, announced it on the 2nd of August of this year, and it's because of that we have a problem. Now, as you say, Mr. McKinley, when this came before the IAEA Board of Governors, there was a vote in the Board of Governors. It was actually a vote of 22 in favour of declaring Iran non-compliant. 1 against, which is Venezuela, and the rest abstained, and that was quite a shock to the Iranians, because they thought that they could, with the most votes we mustered, would be 18. In fact, we had India on side, and if Venezuela had not voted against, we would have ended up with a consensus. So that's where it is at the moment. Enrichment remains suspended. There are further conversations taking place. I hope that it is possible to resolve this matter within the Board of Governors of the IAEA, but the statutes of the IAEA themselves provide that if such matters can't be resolved, then there can be a reference to the Security Council. As to whether that's necessary or when it would take place, that is a choice that we would make. We certainly wouldn't announce it in advance.
Greg Poe, you said on a number of occasions that it's inconceivable that military action would be taken against Iran, and whilst I'm sure that's true at the moment, it presumably isn't really the case if one looks to the future. I can't see Israel, for example, standing by and allowing Iran to develop a nuclear weapons capability. For that matter, I can't really see the United States allowing that to happen. And so my point is, it's not inconceivable.
Well, Mr. Pope, I speak for the British government. I don't presume to speak for the Israeli government, and they've got to make their own decisions. And it was in that context, and in the context of the nuclear dossier, that I made those remarks. The second thing to say is that I think people need to chill a bit on this. Military action is not on anybody's agenda with respect to Iran. That has been made clear repeatedly by the American government, including by Condoleezza Rice yesterday in a joint interview which I did with her from Birmingham, Alabama, and as I now know it should be pronounced. It's simply not on the agenda. And yes, there was always a caveat entered on behalf of the President of the United States, who is also Commander-in-Chief, which I understand, but it is not on the agenda of the American government. It's not on our agenda. It's not on anybody's agenda on the Board of Governors. And my judgment is that we have to work extremely hard to resolve this by diplomatic means. What I know is that where we are united, as we have been until very recently, completely united, we can get a long way. And I also know that the Iranians were surprised, I think a little chastened, by the extent to which we got not unanimous support in the last Board of Governors, but very significant and substantial support, which they thought they would go their way.
Okay, the committee visited Iran, went to Tehran and Isfahan about 2 years ago, and it was quite a friendly visit, certainly in comparison to when we went to France at about the same time. And I know that
I shall make sure that our ambassador in Tehran tells the Iranian government that.
And I know that you've invested quite a lot of time and effort personally in the UK relationship with Iran, but I just think that over the last 2 years things have deteriorated somewhat. There's been the case where British soldiers were essentially kidnapped in the Shatt al-Arab waterway. There's, as Mr. McKinley has pointed out, compelling evidence that Iranian-produced or Iranian-financed weapons are being used against UK forces in the south of Iraq. And it just seems to us that our diplomatic relationship is not as good as it was 2 years ago when we went. And would you characterise it thus? And if so, what can we do about it?
Well, look, it's not just that. Yeah. There is a difficult period in the relationship between Iran and the international community. And just bear in mind that every move that we, the United Kingdom, has made has been in concert with France and Germany. And through that E3 arrangement, the rest of the European Union as well. And it's, people say, what's the point of an EU foreign policy? Well, this is the point of an EU foreign policy. And increasingly, we've had the active support of the United States government backing our proposals. And we're working in improving cooperation with the Russian Federation as well as other countries. So that's the situation. Iran had elections. They were imperfect elections because of their constitutional system, but they produced a result in which President Ahmadinejad became elected. He's taken office. It's a new government. And I was present at the United Nations General Assembly when he made the speech that he made and set out his stall. So there is it is a more difficult environment than it was 2 years ago. However, that's not a reason for abandoning the diplomatic route. I also just say that you have to try and understand where the Iranians are coming from. And Iran is a very proud nation with a very fine past. It is also a nation which, for rather good reason, has felt that it has been over-dominated by great power politics in turns by Russia, by the United Kingdom, by the United States. And that is part of their national consciousness, as is this very powerful sense of their own national dignity. So we've got to take that into account. And the argument over the Non-Proliferation Treaty is complicated, because the Iranians say Article 4 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty entitles us to the full panoply that is necessary to generate electricity by nuclear power. On the face of it, that is correct. However, there's an obligation under Article 2, which is not to do anything towards developing nuclear weapons capability. And the intersection of these two comes at the point of the fuel cycle. And that is why there is such anxiety about the use to which the Iranians are intending to put the fuel that they would generate. So that's what we have to work on. But as far as I'm concerned, I think I can here speak for the French and German government and for Javier Solana, we're just going to keep going on this.
Fabian Hamilton.
Thank you, Chairman. Foreign Secretary, can I just follow on from what Mr. Pope's just been saying about the possibilities of military action or otherwise against Iran? I'm sure you'll have heard of the Heritage Foundation, the right-wing think tank in Washington that...
Are they supporting me?
Has a great influence. I don't think they're supporting you. In fact, they're not supporting you. Has a great influence on President Bush's policies. I'm delighted to hear what you say about what Condoleezza Rice has said about the possibility of any kind of military action against Iran. However, as you may recall, a few weeks ago, Dr. Niall Gardner, who is somebody we met with a couple of years ago in Washington, was on the Newsnight programme. And on that programme, he told Jeremy Paxman that it's about time we stopped using the carrot and waved the stick at Iran. In other words, we would have to do something quite radical to stop them developing nuclear weapons if they didn't stop of their own accord. Are you worried by that? Do you think that his views are likely to penetrate the White House at some stage and force them into military action if Iran doesn't go along with the IAEA?
He's got his point of view. Was that the programme that I was on? Was that?
No, it was one I was on, actually.
You were on, okay.
Helping you out.
Thank you very much. Let me just repeat the position of the American government as spelt out yesterday and before by Secretary Rice. To quote what she said, military action is not on the agenda of the United States at this time. And she then went on to say words to the effect that the United States government had been giving support for the E3 process, and they have, and we're very grateful to the United States government for that support. And each resolution that we have had before the Board of Governors has also been actively supported by the United States. So that's where we are. I mean, as I say, one can endlessly speculate. I think I've made our position fairly clear. I believe that the diplomatic route is the right one, and it's not just about diplomacy across the table. It's about the pressure that one can exercise through the international community on a country like Iran. It could also be exercised on us in different circumstances. It's about the power of the United Nations system that we're dealing with here.
So in other words, you are still wholly committed to constructive engagement, which is the British government's continuing policy.
Yes, and let me say, for all sorts of reasons, sometimes it's hard going with Iran, but I happen to be committed to it, and I happen to think it's far better than the alternative, which is what we need to think about.
Thank you. Gisela Stewart, briefly on this, and then we'll move on to questions on Syria.
Just very quick following on. If none of that pressure works, it surely is the minimum. It's the end of the non-proliferation treaties.
It may be the end of the non-proliferation treaty. I mean, it depends on the circumstances. I mean, meanwhile, there are other challenges for the non-proliferation treaty. Because there are only three members of the United Nations not signed up to the non-proliferation treaty, but they all happen to have a nuclear weapons capability. So trying to deal with that is also something we have to factor into our approach.
Thank you. Andrew McCarthy.
Foreign Secretary, I want to bring you on to another problem state in the region, namely Syria, whose regime quite rightly has had the international spotlight focused on it, particularly in the last few days. And I'd appreciate your comments on the German prosecutor's findings. And of course, we will all recall that he was doing this at the request of the Secretary General of the United Nations, which confirmed that Syria was intimately involved in the assassination of Prime Minister Hariri in Beirut back in February. That against the backcloth that the Interior Minister Canaan seems to have conveniently committed suicide in the last few weeks, and against a backcloth of serious allegations which appear to be very well founded, with a significant number of Saddam Hussein's regime are being harboured in Syria with no effort to bring them to justice. And finally, against the backdrop that security advisors say to us, but almost security advisors say to us, but almost certainly the Syrian border is the most porous and the most dangerous border in Iraq, and I'd appreciate your comments.
Thank you. Well, the findings of the Melis Commission are very serious indeed. They're so serious that Secretary Rice and I have agreed that there should be a ministerial meeting of the Security Council, and we're currently fixing up a date for that, but it'll be very shortly, provided we can get other countries on board for that. And this report which I've got in front of me requires an answer from the international community. You cannot have a member of the United Nations, which has subscribed to the Charter of Human Rights and much else besides, deciding that the way it resolves its problems is having people at least at a pretty senior level complicit in the murder of political opponents in a country which is regarded by every other member of the United Nations as independent. This is simply intolerable. So we have got to meet. We've got to decide what we do next in respect of the conclusions of the Melis Commission. There's also, let me say, business in respect of resolution 1559. There are two resolutions we're dealing with here. 1595 was the one which established the Melis Commission. 1559 was the one that required, an earlier one, required Syria to remove its troops and its penetration of Lebanon altogether. And it's made some progress on that. It certainly removed its troops, but there is it still has to do a very great deal more. One of the things it has to do is to recognise the Lebanon as an independent member of the United Nations and put embassies into Beirut, exchange ambassadors. These are very elementary matters, but really important matters. So that's where we are. On the second point that you raised, Mr. Mackay, which is about penetration of the border, you're right to say that this is the most dangerous and the most porous border into Iraq. The Syrians have taken some steps to improve security and cooperation across the border. And I don't know whether Mr. Goodrum may want to add something on that, but they've got to take many more, and they've also, this is an associated point, got to be categorical in ceasing to allow Syria to be used as a base for Hamas and Islamic Jihad. It is almost a joke in the Arab region, and regarded as such, when Syrian leaders say that Hamas and Islamic Jihad are not allowed to operate from Syria. I recently met a very well-known senior Arab journalist. He just got out his pocketbook and said, if I want to talk to the leaders of Hamas or Islamic Jihad, I phone these numbers in Damascus. I am told that they've moved. You then leave a message and they phone you back within 5 minutes from Damascus. It's a charade, but it's all part of the same problem. Do you want to add anything else?
Well, only to say that yes, as the Foreign Secretary said, there is some evidence that Syria has taken some steps with respect to its border with Iraq, but the sense we have is that those steps have been half-hearted, grudging and tactical in nature. What we've been looking for is a strategic decision on the part of the regime in Damascus to get to grips with the problem of the insurgents moving in and out of Iraq from Syria, and so far we've not seen that, and that's what we continue to press for.
Foreign Secretary, that was an appropriately Foreign Secretary, that was an appropriately robust response you've just given, and I commend you for it. So, does that mean that your answer on Syria is the same as the one you gave in Iran, when a colleague a few moments ago said, would we take part in any invasion of Syria or taking out certain key people from Syria? You were very specific. On Iran, because you said no plans, not on the agenda, cool it, calm it. Yeah. Are you going to repeat that to me for Syria?
What we're doing at the moment is discussing with the Americans and other partners the draft of a response that will go before the Security Council, and let us take these things one step at a time.
Very interesting answer. The one last question, which perhaps you can answer slightly more fully than that. Your relationship with your opposite number in Damascus must be
Dr. Farouk al-Shara.
Yes, that must be very ragged now in the light of this report. Is it worthwhile keeping up diplomatic relations at the moment with Syria?
Well, as it happens, I've not seen Dr. Farouk al-Shara, I think, since I saw him in Sharm el-Sheikh at the conference there earlier in the year. My judgment is, yes, it is worth keeping up diplomatic relations with Syria, and I certainly would not wish them to be brought to an end unilaterally. I mean, we keep up diplomatic relations with a great many countries, including, for example, Burma. I mean, I'm not comparing them directly, but we do because we think it's worthwhile, and with Zimbabwe.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ken Purchase.
Very quickly, that the answer which Mr. Mackay described as interesting was also unconvincing, and that people will be extremely concerned following the President Bush's remarks in regard to his view of Syria. We do need some assurance that it is not the intention of the British government to be led by the nose into attacks on Syria. We've been there before, and many people would be very unhappy if we thought we were going there again.
I mean, let me just reassure you. The issue of, we're talking here about diplomatic decisions being made within the United Nations system. There's been no discussion that I've taken part in with the United States about military action in respect of Syria. None whatever. And I don't think it's on their agenda either. I mean, let's be clear about that.
The President seemed to put it on the agenda.
Provide the reassurance that Mr Mackay sought. And I also just look, Iraq was Iraq. We supported. I know that you didn't, but the British Parliament supported the judgments that we made as a government in respect of Iraq, and we did it in a very open way. We had 3 debates running from September through to 02 to March 03 with votes. And it could not have been done in a more open way. Okay, and we made our judgment. I have to think it's the right one, and people can discuss the counterfactuals, the what ifs we hadn't supported the United States. I think the situation would be altogether worse. But anyway, that's where we are. On these other issues, we are working very carefully and well with the United States government, judge them by the decisions which they have made. With respect of Iran, judge the United States by the fact that it has given us not decreasing but increasing support for the E3 EU process, notwithstanding the fact, as I was I think agreeing with Mr Pape, that the environment has become more difficult, not less difficult. In respect of Syria, we have a problem. It's a problem for the international community. 1559 is a resolution co-sponsored originally by France and the United States, with us coming in behind. France has been as much in the lead on this as has the United States. I've just come from a commemoration service in St Paul's Cathedral to commemorate the 60th anniversary of the foundation of the United Nations. I mean, what we all know about the United Nations is that where it works together, it is a force for good without the necessity for military action. And I just also to say in respect of Iraq, if you're asking me, if we'd ever been able to get that second resolution with an ultimatum, I think the chances are we wouldn't have had to go to war, as a matter of fact. But there we are. That's to discuss. You don't have to have these on the agenda, particularly where you've got good, strong backing from the international community.
Can we just switch focus now, Sandra?
Foreign Secretary, I would like to ask you about the issue of extraordinary rendition. In response to this committee's report of last year on the war against terrorism, the government said that it was not aware of the use of its territory or airspace for the purposes of extraordinary rendition. But it appears there's a growing body of evidence to suggest that UK airspace is indeed being utilised for this purpose, albeit mainly in the media. And some of the suggestions seem to be extremely detailed. For example, The Guardian has reported that operations have flown into the UK at least 210 times since 9/11.
So just repeat that, sorry.
The aircraft involved in the operations have flown into the UK at least 210 times since 9/11, an average of 1 flight a week. And it appears that the favourite destination is Prestwick Airport, just next to my constituency, as it happens. Can you comment on that? What role is the UK playing in the extraordinary rendition process?
The position in respect of extraordinary rendition was set out in the letter which the head of our parliamentary team wrote to Mr Priestley, your clerk, on the 11th of March. Our position hasn't changed. And we were not aware of the use of our territory or airspace for the purpose of extraordinary rendition. We've not received any requests or granted any permissions for the use of UK territory or airspace for such purposes. It is perfectly possible, that there have been 200 movements of United States aircraft in and out of the United Kingdom. In fact, I would have thought it was many more, but that's because we have a number of US Air Force bases here, which under the Visiting Forces Act and other arrangements, they're entitled to use under certain conditions. So I don't see for a second how a conclusion can be drawn from the fact that there have been some scores of movements of US military aircraft. Well, so what? But that therefore means that they're being used for rendition. I mean, I think that's a very, very long chain.
But the UN Commission on Human Rights has started an inquiry into the British government's role in this. Is the government cooperating fully with that inquiry? Why would they start an inquiry if there was no reason to believe
this was actually happening?
People start inquiries for all sorts of reasons. But I assume we're cooperating with it. I'm not aware of any requests, but we always cooperate with such requests.
Okay, Orkidge.
These, Secretary, are not US military flights. These are Gulfstream aircraft used by the CIA. They have a 26-strong fleet of Gulfstream aircraft that are used for this purpose. And these aircraft are not coming into British bases, they are coming into airports, some RAF bases including Northolt, some bases like Prestwick, as Miss Osborne said. And whilst it's always good to have the head of your parliamentary staff respond to our clerk, Mr Priestley, could you give us an assurance that you will investigate these flights, specific flights, and if it is the case that these flights are being used for the process of extraordinary rendition, which is contrary to international law and indeed contrary to the stated policy of Her Majesty's government, would you attempt to see that they should stop?
Well, I'd like to see what it is that's being talked about here. I mean, I'm very happy, as you expect, I did endorse the letter was sent by our parliamentary team to your clerk on the 11th of March. But I'm happy, to the avoidance of any doubt, to say I specifically endorse its content. If there is evidence, we'll look at it, but simply a suggestion in a newspaper that there have been flights by unspecified foreign aircraft in and out of the United Kingdom cannot possibly add up to evidence that our airspace or our facilities have been used for the purpose of unlawful rendition. I mean, it just doesn't.
No, I accept that, but if there were evidence of that,
well, I mean, look,
you would join with us, presumably, in condemning.
I'm not going to prejudge an inquiry. If there were evidence, we would look at it. So far, we've not seen any evidence.
Richard?
Our former ambassador to Uzbekistan, Craig Murray, has stated in a document to us that it is, I can confirm, is a positive policy decision by the US and UK to use Uzbek torture material. The evidence, he also goes on, is that the aircraft that my colleague referred to earlier, the Gulfstreams, are taking detainees back to Uzbekistan who are then being tortured. Is that not some indication that these detainees are being transferred through the UK?
Mr Murray's opinion, Mr Murray, as you may know, stood in my constituency. He got fewer votes than the British National Party, and notwithstanding the fact that he ensured the widest possible audience to his views about the use of torture within the constituency. I set out British government's position on this issue. I've set it out on a number of occasions, including in evidence both here and to the Intelligence and Security Committee, but I wrote a pretty detailed letter to a constituent of mine back in June, setting out our position. And as I said there are no circumstances in which British officials use torture, nor any question of the British government seeking to justify the use of torture. And on again, the British government, including intelligence and security agencies, never use torture for any purpose, including information, nor would we instigate or connive at others doing so. So, I mean, that's the position. People have to make their own judgments about whether they think I'm being accurate or not.
Eric Gilsley.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Foreign Secretary, the letter the letter which you supplied to the committee in March, which gave the conclusion that the British government is not aware of the use of its territory or airspace for the purposes of extraordinary rendition, was taken at face value by most members of the committee at that time before the election, and we took that to mean that we were not aware of any extraordinary rendition and that it wasn't happening. The press reports were therefore something of a surprise. What I'd like to ask is whether our government would be contacted by any country flying or using our airspace, taking suspects to other countries. Would we be asked for permission? Would there be any circumstances where we would be contacted? Or is it a case that it could well be happening, but our government is not aware of it, simply because we have not been informed or our permission is not necessary?
I mean, look, Mr. Ozzie, on the precise circumstances in which foreign governments apply for permission to use British airspace, I'd have to write to you because it's important that I get make that accurate. I mean, let me say what I said in the letter, or what Mr. Stanton on my behalf said in the letter is accurate. I mean, why would I, for a second, knowingly provide this committee with false information? If I had information about rendition, we don't practice rendition, full stop. I mean, I also just say that whether rendition is contrary to international law depends on the particular circumstances in each case. It's not. It depends, but we don't practice it. But I'd have to come back to you on that question.
So we respect a letter. Thank you very much. John Horan, Afghanistan, please.
Yes, Foreign Secretary. Can we look at the subject of Afghanistan? Okay. I mean, there are worrying signs of deterioration there, are there not?
Of deterioration
in the situation.
Well, they are worries. I mean, the situation in Afghanistan.
Sorry, I did say they're not.
No, sorry, I said I'm not quite sure what signs you're referring to. I mean,
well, the strengthening of the Taliban and Al Qaeda, some evidence that the sort of methods being used in Iraq are now being used in Afghanistan.
There's been a terrorist problem in Afghanistan from the time that the Taliban were in the main defeated. When I visited Kandahar in the summer of 2003, there had been a bomb in a mosque the day before. A large number, some people have been killed, a large number of people have been injured. Indeed, I saw some of the people being very severely injured, laid out in a field hospital in what had been the departures lounge of Kandahar International Airport. So this has been going on for some time. I mean, the better news, Mr. Horan, is that you've had a presidential election. You've now had the parliamentary and provincial elections with the final results expected by the end of this month. You'll have the first session of the Parliament on the 19th of December, and that will mark the culmination of the political track of the bond process. If you think about where Afghanistan was 4 years ago, this is a dramatic improvement. I mean, I don't know, is anybody arguing that we should
accept that entirely,
okay.
But equally, I mean, the evidence we have is that to set against that, there are clear signs that the Taliban and Al Qaeda are reviving, certainly in the southern provinces.
Is
that right?
I haven't got the precise figures about Taliban activity. It is certainly the case that they are not completely defeated, and they remain quite a serious challenge. And that's something we have to deal with along with our American colleagues and those. So, you know, there are two operations. There's ISAF,
sure,
and there's also Operation Enduring Freedom, which is based on Kandahar.
Presumably the NATO Secretary General Jacques de Hoop Scheffer's argument that you must increase the amount of military intervention there from 10,000 personnel to 15,000. He's presumably working on the assumption that unless he does that, the situation will get worse. Or it's improved sufficiently well.
There's the issue of terrorism. There's also the issue of ensuring that the writ of the elected government runs, which is
well, they're linked, aren't they?
They are in some areas, and they're not in other areas. But they're part. But it's essentially
they're linked in the problem areas.
In ensuring that there is effective order. And as you will know, Mr. Horan, we're proposing to first do two things. One is to put the ARC in from May of 2006, and the second is to increase our total forces quite substantially.
Have you got a figure for that?
There is a figure. I'm not certain whether I'm at liberty to issue it, but because it's a matter for my colleague John Reid. There's going to be an announcement this week, I'm told, Soto Victory. Thank you very much. Is there not much left? What day? Monday? Okay, yeah, this week there's going to be an announcement.
Are we going to have to make a big effort to further improve the situation in Afghanistan?
To
further improve the situation
yes,
in Afghanistan? Are we going to have to make a big effort?
We've got the interesting. I mean, this has now become almost a cliche, but whilst in Iraq their fear is of occupation, in Afghanistan the fear is of abandonment, and in Iraq.
How far do you feel that the situation in Afghanistan has suffered as a result of their abandonment by the attention being drawn to Iraq?
No, I don't think that.
But you just said it was.
Sorry, I said that.
They fear abandonment.
No, I said that the Iraqis fear occupation. I'm just dealing with the differences in the psychological makeup, the political psychological makeup of the Iraqis as opposed to the Afghans. Whilst the Iraqis fear occupation, in Afghanistan and say they wish that our troops to leave as quickly as possible once the security situation is better. In Afghanistan, they fear abandonment because they saw what abandonment.
They can only fear abandonment because we have abandoned them to some extent.
No, it's much more. No, it's to do much more with what happened over a 30-year period, when in fact the international community did abandon them after the in the mid-70s, and then in turn they were left to the devices of the Soviet bloc, and then there was this, as it were, interim strategy of funding Mujahideen, which that then sort of morphed into the Taliban. So not altogether satisfactory. That's why I'm simply making the point that this is a long-term commitment by the international community and by the UK, both in terms of money and in terms of our military presence. And there's going to be this announcement.
What do you think is the biggest problem in
later this week? Sorry, Mr. Moore.
What do you think is the biggest problem in Afghanistan now?
Well, there are a number of linked problems. There is a problem of terrorism. There is a problem of drugs. The problem of corruption and of poor governance. These are as well
pretty
as
big problems.
What? No, of course they're big problems. But if you take account of where the country started 4 years ago, these are problems which can be overcome. And significantly, though it's imperfect, the Afghans are embracing the idea of democracy, just as they are in Iraq.
But my point is, can you make the kind of big or significant increase in effort there to deal with the problems you just outlined in Afghanistan, while at the same time being committed to a situation in Iraq which is as difficult as it is?
Yes, I mean, and if you're asking me about troop numbers, obviously if you want detailed information, you need to ask defence ministers. But although we have our commitment in Iraq remains substantial, our troop numbers are now well below 10,000. I mean, bear in mind that at the height of the war there were 46,000 troops in theatre, and the judgment of John Reid and of the Chief of the Defence Staff is that the increase in troop numbers, which will be announced for Afghanistan later this week, is one that can be sustained, and that's their judgment, not mine.
Thank you. John Maples, Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I wonder if we could move to some other parts of the Middle East, particularly Saudi Arabia and Egypt. One of the things this committee has been interested in, and so has the government, is the process of what one might broadly call sort of Arab reform, or reform in Arab countries, both in terms of economy and in terms of sort of development of government, human rights, better governance, that sort of thing. If we could just look at those two specific countries of Saudi Arabia and Egypt, I know there are others, but they seem to me to be the most important. Do you think we are seeing real progress?
In respect of Saudi Arabia?
Well, let's take Saudi Arabia and Egypt. I mean, they maybe give me different answers to the two questions. But are we seeing real progress both in terms of economic and political reform? I don't mind sort of how slow it is, but do you think things are actually happening?
I think there is progress being made. I mean, in Egypt, as you'll be aware, they've begun multi-party elections. It has been slow progress. I mean, Mr. Goodrum may want to talk about both, actually.
Well, in respect of Egypt, of course, we've already had the presidential elections, and the country is now gearing up for the parliamentary elections, which will take place in three stages, three periods. And I would agree with you. I think it is a significant development. What we saw both in the presidential elections and what we're now expecting to see in the parliamentary elections, there is clearly a development towards more democratization in Egypt. Saudi Arabia, of course, is further behind, but it has now held municipal elections, and the government there does appear to be committed to what I think is fair to describe as an evolutionary approach to further democratization in that country. I expect it will be fairly slow, but I think the new King Abdullah, has gone on the record, I think, to say that they do want to move this forward.
One of the things we've discussed before on this subject is a view I take, and I think a lot of others share, that there are some sort of pretty fundamental things that have to be in place before democracy is going to work. Things like the rule of law, a relatively uncorrupt government, a private sector which is a growing middle class, if I want to put it like that. Do you think, are we seeing evidence that, let's say, good governance, lack of corruption, objectivity, that sort of thing, and the rule of law, are we seeing any developments on those fronts? Because those seem to me in some ways to be more important than the actual elections, at least in this stage of the process.
Well, I think we're seeing patchy progress. I think we have to be realistic. We're not obviously we would like to see more progress more quickly, but I think you can point to some countries where the processes are improving over time. And to refer back to what the Foreign Secretary was referring to earlier, the fund that we have available in the FCO, the Engaging with the Islamic World Fund, the 10 million pounds that the Foreign Secretary referred to, we're using a lot of that money for precisely projects designed to bolster rule of law, the participation of women in the political and democratic processes in various countries in the region. So we're doing what we can.
Do you think that, now I'm sure we're doing a lot, but do you think there is a recognition on the part of, let's take those two governments, Saudi Arabia and Egypt, maybe again you're going to give me different answers on both, but do you think there's a recognition in either or both of those of the need to move down this track, that if they do actually want to become part of the mainstream world, become prosperously growing economies, that kind of thing, these are essential ingredients? Or do you think that's not really how they see it, and they think, oh gosh, I suppose we better do something because the British and the Americans are pestering us about it?
No, I think there are signs that, I mean, particularly in Egypt, of course, where President Mubarak has said repeatedly that this is the direction he wants to take Egypt in, but that they will have to go at their own pace, and I think that's reasonable. They need to obviously gauge how much progress they can make at each stage. Obviously, we have been doing what we can to encourage the process of democratization. We're not alone. There is a G8 process that is active, but we're very careful to put that in the context of encouragement rather than trying to impose or direct, because that would clearly be counterproductive.
Do you think that in terms of economic development, do you think that the governments of countries like Egypt and Saudi Arabia look around the world and say, how is it that Malaysia and South Korea and China and India can start making this phenomenal economic progress and we make none? You know, if we didn't have oil, we'd be bust. Well, in the case of Egypt, that's
I think they do, and I mean that was really the central theme of the report of the Arab intellectuals who reported a couple of years ago, that seminal report by the United Nations Development Programme. The
development programme recognised that, but did the governments about whom
they are increasingly recognising this, I think, and I mean the figures are startling. That, for example, more Hewlett-Packard obtains more patents every 2 weeks than have been issued in respect of Arab countries over a 20-year period. The intellectual impoverishment of this region is terrible, and I think that increasingly Arab leaders are recognising that. I mean, those of you who've not read it, book I read over the summer, The World is Flat by Tom Friedman, spells out as a very useful synopsis of the challenge affecting the Arab region. And Mr. Baker was absolutely right to say that the countries in the Arab world were at least on a level with Malaysia, China, South Korea, if not doing rather better than them 50 years ago in terms of overall living standards. They are now way behind. I mean, it's a really serious issue for them. But there are some signs of improvement, and there was the joint conference on Saudi reform, which I chaired with His Royal Highness Prince Saad Al Faisal. It was in February, I think.
That's right.
Really, so you'd said to me even a year ago there was going to be this kind of joint conference. One would have been very sceptical, but it indicates actually an increasing commitment by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to this reform programme. There's similar different commitments by the government of Egypt. Mr. Chairman, I wonder if I could just crave the indulgence of the committee. I had understood that this session would last for an hour and a half. I think others thought it would last for 2 hours. It would certainly be to my convenience if we could finish in 7 or 8 minutes. Which is closer to 2 hours than an hour and a half.
I think we will aim to do that, and we will see how quickly we can get there. If my colleagues are disciplined, can I then ask some questions about the Middle East in another region, which is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You talked about impoverishment of people and lack of political progress. I mean, the question I would like to ask is, what is your assessment of the impact of the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza on the possibilities of political process going further? And do you think that's going to have any impact on terrorism in the region?
Well, we welcomed, and I welcomed, the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. If your aim is a separate state of Palestine, you've got to start somewhere. You've got to start, my judgment, with the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. So it's a necessary, but not a sufficient, precondition to the establishment of that state. It is also a test for the Palestinian Authority whether it has the capacity and the will to build up what would be an embryonic mini state. A great deal of effort is going in to support them in terms of security reform and through Jim Wolfenson, the whole process of reconstruction. So it is a good step rather than, the reverse. On the issue of terrorism, the quicker that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is resolved by political processes, the quicker we can see an end to the terrorism which has so shattered lives on both sides of the Green Line.
Do you see a role for either the UK, the EU, or some other international body in facilitating the ongoing process? It's not
You're talking about security forces?
Well, either as security forces or facilitating the negotiation process, given that the Israelis seem to be saying that there are not going to be any more dramatic unilateral steps, and that the Palestinians have got an election, the Israelis have got a political power struggle within Likud. Can we and others internationally do something now to keep the process going, keep the momentum?
We are doing, but I think it's important that we shouldn't reinvent new structures. We've got the quartet arrangement now. It's working. Had a good meeting in late September in New York, which I attended, and we just need to keep that going. And there was a very, very positive commitment all around the table from the UN, from the Russian Federation, from the US, and from the EU to this process and to the conclusions we came up with. Now, in terms of is there a contribution that we can make, there are many contributions we can make. We are making them in many respects, including continuing support and advice to the Palestinian Authority for security sector reform. We would also be willing to consider any requests which came in for other assistance.
Thank you. Fabian Hamilton, one final question on this.
Foreign Secretary, there's no doubt that the security barrier, wall, whatever you will call it, has helped the Israelis keep out some atrocities that might have happened had they not had it. The big problem is where it goes. We've had the Israeli High Court making judgments that the route of the wall or plan for the wall or barrier has been entirely wrong, cutting off Palestinians from their own farmland. What can we do to ensure that if they continue to build this barrier, they don't further create resentment amongst Palestinians and exacerbate some of the terrorist acts that are taking place?
I don't think, if they do continue to build the wall way from the Green Line.
Well, I'm thinking about the way they're encircling East Jerusalem, for example.
And indeed, the way encircling East Jerusalem. This will exacerbate tensions. However, there's a prior question here, which is the building of settlements, because the wall is not being rooted in the abstract, it's being rooted around settlements, and great concern of us and of many others is the creation by the Israelis of facts on the ground. It's for that and many other reasons that we feel so strongly against any development, further development in the E1 sector, which will lead to the complete encirclement of East Jerusalem. Even so, on current plans, access between East Jerusalem and Ramallah and the south is going to become more difficult, which is certainly of very great concern to us. So what do? Keep up the pressure. We keep talking to international partners, particularly the Americans, as I have done pretty continuously, and to the Israelis.
Andrew McKinley's indicating that he wants to come in. Can you be extremely brief?
I can, but this has happened before, this problem of timing. You should see the rebrand television, but I'll move straight to my...
Very brief.
Yeah. The former Soviet Union, there are decaying things such as lighthouses around the coast of the Soviet Union where there's material which can be taken, people who want to develop...
or like light bulbs?
No, I'm surprised you're quite flip about that, because there's material which could go into dirty bombs, and there's clearly evidence about that. I'm surprised you take that view, Foreign Secretary, because, well, I mean, I'm only responding. So, and there's also been reports that the marketplace for that is in the stars, and certainly there was quite a detailed and I thought authoritative piece on BBC Today PM programme by Rob Broomby about this, and it relates to what this committee has drawn attention to in the past. One, about the access of these materials throughout the old former Soviet Union, by way of example, lighthouses in remote places which are looted, and also the fact that we're concerned about the stars, and we haven't had and have not got representations, for instance, in Kyrgyzstan, where there's also the problem of Islamic refugees from Uzbekistan. So, in a sense, because we are under time constraints, there are really some related things here. One is the decay and access of stuff around the former Soviet Union. Two is the marketplace in the stars. And three is the absence of our representation in this very fragile country of Kyrgyzstan, which has this issue and the issue of the refugees from Uzbekistan.
Leave aside my flippant remark about light bulbs, but we have done a great deal since the breakup of the Soviet Union to support the safe custody process, and so is the American government, and the program has a name. We allocated a lot of money to this, and I'm not actually aware of. I don't recall seeing anything recently in which there were very serious concerns have been raised about the security of nuclear arsenals in this.
Well, Foreign Secretary, I'm surprised, because you know how I don't normally.
We can write to you.
Well, when there are sometimes authoritative articles in newspapers.
Yes, sure.
Unusually, there was quite an authoritative item on a radio programme which specifically dealt with this issue of the materials to which I've referred, the sources to which I referred, and specifically said about Kyrgyzstan, where we haven't got this representation.
We will look.
Can we have a note from you?
We could have a note about Kyrgyzstan. And also have a note about representation in Kyrgyzstan. Well, we are credited there.
But in Almaty.
I apologise if there was a confusion. We were definitely expecting a 2-hour session and concluding with a 7 o'clock vote, but clearly somehow or other wires got crossed. I'm grateful for you coming along and enduring nearly 2 hours, and we look forward to seeing you again in a few weeks' time when you come and talk about the European Union presidency. Just to give you notice, I will be writing on behalf of the committee concerning the report we produced on Cyprus and the response we received from your department, because we want to pursue that issue further as well at some point. But we aren't going to ask any questions now. I just
on Cyprus.
I'll put it up your agenda.
But I think I you had a detailed response to them.
Yes, we've had a response. Thank you. We want to pursue that. Can I thank you and your colleagues, Dr. Goodrum and Mr. Richmond, for coming along, and the meeting is adjourned.
Thank you very much. Thank you.